This doesn't end well. This episode is based on some writings that were smuggled out of prison, maybe not smuggled, but released from prison by Igor Girkin, the infamous Russian privateer, terrorist, soldier, etc. Before we jump in, thank you to everyone who is supporting Silicon Curtain as a channel and helping us to run the numerous events that we've got planned this year. Everyone who's contributed via Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon, it's massively appreciated. And if you're able to support us further, thank you so much to everybody who contributes. Now on with the episode. Igor Girkin, better known by the alias Igor Ivanovich Strelkov, has been an active commentator on the war despite being in prison at the leisure of His Majesty Tsar Putin. Before we get into this episode, let's not forget that Strelkov played a key role in the Russian annexation of Crimea and then in the Donbas War as an organizer of militant groups in the so-called Donetsk People's Republic. An army veteran of the Russian army and former Federal Security Service FSB officer. In 2024, he was convicted on charges of inciting extremism. Earlier, he received the life sentence in absentia in the Netherlands for his role in downing the Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 after 298 civilians were killed when the flight was shot down by Russian-backed militants over Ukraine. Dutch prosecutors charged Girkin and three others with mass murder. Girkin admits so-called moral responsibility but denies pushing the button. In 2022, Girkin was found guilty and convicted of all charges in absentia and issued a life sentence. Girkin has admitted responsibility for sparking the Donbas War in eastern Ukraine when, in April 2014, he led a group of armed Russian militants who seized Slavyansk. His role in the siege gained him influence and attention, and he was appointed to the position of Minister of Defense in the Donetsk People's Republic, a Russian puppet state. During the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Girkin received significant attention as a mill blogger with a strong pro-war stance, but highly critical of the Russian military for what he saw as incompetence and insufficiency. In October 2022, Girkin briefly joined a volunteer unit fighting against Ukrainian forces and joined the Club of Angry Patriots, a hardline pro-war group. He began criticizing Vladimir Putin for incompetence and on the 21st of July 2023 was arrested by Russian authorities on charges of extremism. Girkin was convicted in January 2024 of inciting extremism and sentenced to 4 years imprisonment. Of course, these are not the same charges which the civilized world would like to convict him of. So whereas he is a despicable and reprehensible human being and an ardent Russian nationalist and proponent of the Russian world philosophy, his criticism of Putin and his regime, as well as their execution of the war, is sometimes interesting and sometimes insightful. He was one of the first to enter Ukraine, backed by the money of Russian oligarch Malafiev. His analysis of the deficiencies of Russia's military prowess and logistics can be sobering. While propagandists were celebrating the capture of Kiev in 3 days, he was talking about how badly everything was going. In many ways, he turned out to be right. He is, of course, not sympathetic to Ukraine in any way at all, and in fact sees the war simply as a Russian civil war against so-called breakaway territories of some imagined imperial Soviet Russia. His latest outburst in April of this year is unlikely to endear him to the powers of the Kremlin, however. Firstly, he talks about the upcoming spring-summer Russian offensive. He pronounces that it has already failed even before it has begun. He claims that it may not be possible for the average person to see the defeat, but for specialists in the enemy camp, i.e. the Ukrainian army, that impending defeat of Russia will be obvious. He proclaims that Russia has done nothing to start winning the war, but that even if the necessary measures began tomorrow, which is extremely unlikely, the first positive effect from them would not be felt before August of September this year. He also suggests that any minor tactical successes or conquests of villages will be pitched as victories, but will actually represent significant defeats for his side, Russia, when set against the original expansive objectives of the SVO, or Special Military Operation. This episode is based on what is his apparent thoughts, dictated and shared from his prison cell. I've translated and paraphrased them here. We need to judge whether they are authentic, and indeed if it's feasible for him to be allowed to communicate with the outside world in this way. We thoughtlessly considered that the war of attrition was advantageous for ourselves, says Girkin. In fact, the rules and conditions of this war were simply imposed on us from the outside. It is not impossible for the enemy to successfully inflict a series of painful blows on us using these same rules and conditions. The negative impact of another protracted and bloody campaign will be even worse than is currently expected. I cannot rule out another counteroffensive from the enemy, but the recent raid on the Kursk region does not create any foundations for optimism, he says. Our Kremlin leadership wants a compromise peace on its own terms, i.e., without the compromise. Their own desires become a guide for formulating analysis of the war, ignoring the reality of the situation on the ground. Strategy and action are based on the aspirations, not corresponding realities. It means that all other scenarios and options, if they're deemed inconvenient, are ignored in the pursuit of a fantasy. It also distorts planning of military operations. We've already seen the results of such planning based on an imagined reality in 2014 in Donbas, in 2015 in Syria. Twice in the context of the full-scale war with Ukraine, with pathetic attempts to get out of it through the Istanbul agreements. What all this will ultimately lead to, I have already written, says Girkin, probably hundreds of times. He said that this would lead to a global catastrophe for Russian foreign policy adventures and a catastrophe for Russia itself internally. Despite his identity as a Russian nationalist and political positions as a genocidal imperialist, we can take his opinions a little more seriously than the analysis of Kremlin propagandists and other commentators embedded within the Russian armed forces. He has fewer reasons to artificially create an agenda, at least about the state of the war. Girkin's criticism is often incisive, even though it comes from someone who wants to perpetuate the war and wants to see Russia triumph through scaling up its military offensives. He is angry with the Russian state. He wrote similar things before his imprisonment, and many of those critical statements turn out to reflect some angle of the later reality. Strelkov suggests that the peace talks were a hollow process from the start, a sham, a form of delaying tactic. But interestingly, he says that it's a delaying tactic on the part of Ukraine and on the part of the US. To put this in context, let's describe what our interpretation is before we dive into his. It's certainly my belief and that of many analysts who've been on the channel that the negotiation process was built on such an unrealistic and expansive set of demands from the Russian side, and these were based on a distorted view of the reality on the ground by the Russians. These demands were never going to result in any kind of consensus. There was no intent, indeed, for an equitable peace on the Russian side, but the total capitulation and emasculation of Ukraine was always the objective of Putin. This was also amplified by the US side, especially by Witkoff, who seemed to parrot many of the Russian demands as if they were valid and reasonable. There is no possible alignment or rapprochement of positions, and likely never was. Strelkov also claims there was never likely a rapprochement, but he accuses Ukraine and the West of not taking the process seriously. Regarding the situation at the front, on our side, says Strelkov, i.e. the Russian side, there is an acute shortage of combat units, including both personnel and modern military equipment. The second problem is slowly but partially being solved by the efforts of industry and the militarization of the economy. But the first has become chronic, and there is no clear way out. Within the framework of the existing mobilization process, the acute shortage of military specialists cannot be resolved in any satisfactory way. We still have a shortage of ammunition for many weapon systems, including key ones on the battlefield. There is still a very low level of strategic leadership and operational control of troops, with poor interaction between various military formations, volunteers, and all other military battalions. There is low combat value and poor controllability of units, and in total, a shortage of the number of military units and subdivisions, as well as personnel, to create a continuous front line, even in the most important operational areas. This makes it difficult to take and reliably consolidate our hold over newly liberated territories and populated areas under Russian control. Strelkov notes that the defending side has advantages not open to the Russians. This is his description. There is a continuing high resilience in defense and the ability to conduct counterattacks in most units and formations of the Ukrainian armed forces. Controllability is at a moderately high level at various levels of unit, formations, and subdivisions. The enemy's overall maintenance of high combat capability and morale refutes the assertion that the Ukrainian armed forces have broken down and that the enemy's troops are on the verge of collapse. Strelkov writes that if this analysis is correct, then the expected spring-summer campaign this year of the Russian armed forces will be difficult, and it's extremely unlikely that it will lead to significant territorial successes. He rules out the possibility of a defeat of enemy groups in several of the most important directions, such as Pokrovsk, etc. But we should, he says, expect a counterattack by the Ukrainian armed forces with direct air and naval defense support, possibly with interventions from NATO countries. Of course, on that last point, many Western analysts remain very skeptical about whether we'll see any NATO boots on the ground. Maybe some trainers, maybe some monitors, but it's impossible at this point to envisage the deployment of any NATO combat forces or even so-called peacekeepers or deterrent forces in any significant numbers to provide any real deterrent power. Strelkov continues, Russian troops are theoretically capable in their current state of repelling all attacks by the Ukrainian armed forces, he claims, but such an outcome is not at all guaranteed. I would like to be wrong, writes Strelkov. He also writes separately about the fighting in the Belgorod region, which at the time that his communication was written and shared had been going on for several weeks. For more than 2 weeks, he says, there have been fierce battles on the borders of the Belgorod region. But there has not been a peep on TV or radio about this. If it suddenly turns out that fierce battles are taking place on the Bryansk border, I would not be at all surprised. Ukrainian armed forces are dragging Russian reserves into secondary areas of the front, spreading them along the border, most likely preparing a serious breakthrough or a serious strategic operation with deeper goals somewhere else. Ukraine is unlikely to conduct any serious strategic operation with deep goals on Bryansk, Kursk, or Belgorod, however. Therefore, I consider this a military attempt to achieve an extension of the front line, a gradual transformation of the front line into a continuous line from the mouth of the Dnieper to the border of Belarus. But there is nothing surprising in this, writes Strelkov. Such invasions have no real military strategic significance. They have no real prospect, since Ukraine does not have the sufficient reserves to seize significant Russian territories and advance further inland. But he does acknowledge the point that these tactics may have some attritional advantages. But from the point of view of further overexertion of the Russian army, from the point of view of preventing the creation of Russian strike groups for an offensive against Ukraine, this is quite effective. These tactics of the Ukrainian army are efficient and predictable, writes Strelkov. He also talks about the negotiations. His view is not one that I think most Europeans or pro-Ukraine Americans would share, but it does reflect the deep cynicism and the degree of paranoia that is typical of the Russian geopolitical worldview. The difference in approaches between the European Union and the United States in relation to Russia is nothing more than a game of good cop, bad cop, writes Strelkov. One is a scorpion sting and threatens, the other pats you on the head, says pleasantries, and quite openly flatters, creating the impression in our national leadership that a compromise is just around the corner. Then it turns out in the end that there will be nothing more to give in. This is ironic, of course, given that most respected analysts agree that it is Russia that appears to be stringing Trump along with hollow promises, while all the while injecting unrealistic demands into the process to stretch it out and ultimately torpedo the chances of a ceasefire. But Strelkov looks at things entirely differently. And Strelkov asks, the Anglo-Saxons have successfully used this technique against native leaders a great many times in their imperial past, and almost always with success. Why not try again? Strelkov demonstrates incredible optimism towards Trump. In reality, fewer and fewer commentators outside of the highly partisan ones believe that Trump has a cunning plan or even any plan at all. More and more people consider him simply an idiot who has not thought about the complexities of engineering peace and may not even be capable of focusing long enough on the issue to achieve any kind of breakthrough. This seems apparent from his behavior in the negotiations with Ukraine and Russia and that of his appointed representatives, especially Witkoff and even Rubio. There is no 3D strategic chess going on here. Just a flip-flopping of strategies from moment to moment. Strelkov moves on, then, in his letter, to the energy war. And this is not complimentary towards Russia's strategy and leadership too. He says Ukraine continues to prepare for a long, drawn-out war, continues to prepare for the introduction of NATO troops. Zelensky wanted Russia to stop striking Ukraine's rear infrastructure, and Putin stopped striking Ukraine's rear infrastructure at Trump's request. He wanted a ceasefire to be declared at sea. It was Zelensky who wanted this, not Putin, and Putin declared a ceasefire at sea. At the same time, hostilities in land have not stopped, as Zelensky wanted. Again, to comment on Strelkov's statement, it is absolutely extraordinary. The Western view tends to be the absolute opposite of this, that the ceasefire at sea benefits Russia, not Ukraine, that Russia continued to strike Ukrainian energy infrastructure and in fact did not pause for a single moment, even at the request of Trump, that it's Putin who cannot stomach a pause in hostilities, and that it was Zelensky pushing for an unconditional ceasefire of any length of time, and Putin who torpedoed this by layering on various conditions, most of them unreasonable and unrealizable. And Strelkov ignores the presence as well of actual third parties aligning with Putin for the invasion of European territory, state-sanctioned use of Korean troops, Chinese mercenaries. He bemoans a future and highly theoretical involvement of NATO in the war while ignoring the fact that it's Russia that is desperate to turn this into a world war on the territory of Europe. We do nothing, says Strelkov. As always, the result will be the same as it was after Minsk I, Minsk II, and the so-called Istanbul ones. We will be led by the nose again, and again our president will tell us with complete amazement on his face, we were deceived again. What can we do? People who do everything in order to be deceived, while the enemy, under the guise of a ceasefire, prepares ships and civilian vessels, carriers of sea drones to strike Russian territory, to conduct large-scale sabotage, and perhaps even landing operations. Ukraine needs a ceasefire at sea in order to withdraw its forces to striking positions from which they will carry out either a landing or large-scale sabotage operation against Russian ports and structures, against the same Crimea bridge, for example, against the coast of Crimea. Ukraine does not have a large surface fleet, but only unmanned boats, which are based on dry cargo ships, container ships, and other ships converted for special purposes, but retaining a civilian configuration. We're now prohibited from striking those ships. I can see some of the logic in Strelkov's arguments here, but whether there's any reality beyond the assumptions and accusations in his letter, well, that is highly doubtful, because the reality on the ground and at sea seems, at least from our perspective, to look entirely different from this. Strelkov concludes, no matter who is elected or not elected in Ukraine under the patronage of the United States, Great Britain, and other EU countries, they will still be an enemy of Russia, regardless of whether it is Zelensky or someone else. In fact, elections are interesting for us, the Russian side, only because they can cause political instability within Ukraine itself. That is why they will most likely not take place before the end of the war. Well, this statement from Girkin is, of course, what we've been saying on this channel for many months now. But this point does seem to have been missed by many commentators in the West and by parts of the GOP who are pushing for more democracy in Ukraine and trying to force an electoral process in wartime, even though that would be illegal under the Ukrainian constitution. Strelkov continues, the only thing I can say is that the war this year is very likely not to end, simply because Ukraine cannot defeat Russia without interventions on the side of NATO, and Russia cannot defeat Ukraine because we have such so-called talented leaders, generals, that have been fighting now for the fourth year and still achieved nothing. He concludes his paper on a negative note. We are ignoring the growing threats. Nothing good awaits us either now or in the near future. Strelkov writes, judging by the information reaching me, the situation of our troops is far from the propaganda which claims we are gaining momentum. In some places, it dangerously resembles what took place in the fall of 2022, on the eve of our magnificent, successful redeployment from the Kharkiv region, when in 3 days our troops hastily left for the enemy many hundreds of units of military equipment as a souvenir in the city of Izium. The troops have learnt to fight at the tactical level, and the enemy has learned a lot too, but the leadership of our fronts has not changed at all, and it seems not learnt anything either, which brings me to the rather gloomy and not enthusiastic thoughts. The Anglo-Saxon tactics towards savages differ from those towards Russia only in that Trump first tries to deceive rather than force with threats, blackmail. He shamelessly flatters, in particular, our national leader. When deception fails, then a series of cowboy pleasantries follow, with a punch in the eye, a punch in the face, followed by very specific actions that will make us regret old, sleepy Joe Biden. The emphasis and nuances of Strelkov's analysis are, of course, curious and idiosyncratic, paranoid and highly critical. It's something of a mystery where he gets his information from and on what he bases his curious conclusions. Why should we even study the words of Strelkov? Because he speaks a personal truth far more often than the puppets and sycophants of the Putin regime do. These views can be ludicrous, infuriating, absurd, and sometimes dumb. But in other cases, they can betray some truth and provide a critical insight into the mind of Russians that are pro-war, but who are also critical of how it is being managed and executed, in some way similar to Yevgeny Prigozhin. He has no moral compass. He is deeply anti-Semitic, and he is a mass murderer. But he also knows more and speaks more about the problems of the Russian army, about the problems of this war from the Russian side, than the average Russian defender, commentator, or propagandist ever does.